Hello, welcome. This is going to be the first lecture for the Art and History section of the book. So if you're looking at our textbook, it is the section that is golden on the side there. We are going to look at, just for a little bit of context, the history of art objects throughout time. So it's chronological, starting with the ancient world and moving up through the Renaissance into the modern world. So as I mentioned in the welcome video, this is a little bit more in depth, and so you'll want to take really thorough notes, read the chapter, and feel free to pause this video if you need to get more thorough notes. So hello, hope everyone's doing okay. These are challenging times, it's really difficult. This is the first lecture, let's see how we do. Afterwards, if you want to give me feedback, send me a message, text me, send me an email to tell me, hey, go slower, or make the notes bigger, whatever. I would appreciate feedback. I know this is challenging for all of you, it's challenging for me as well, so let's see how this goes. I've got my timer set to 45 minutes, so I'm going to keep it to that. And we're going to talk about the ancient world. So this is chapter 16, and we start the ancient world in art history looking at art that was made on the walls. So first, in looking at Paleolithic art, I want you to consider the motivation. So as we're taking notes today, as you're taking notes on the images that are shown, be thinking about the motivations of each of these artists. So we'll cover these and talk about potential ideas. First of all, this is prehistoric. So what do we mean when we say prehistory? Well, simply that is defined as a time where a civilization did not have a written record. So interestingly enough, for us to be able to evaluate the work of Paleolithic artists or ancient artists, it's their art, it's the drawings that they made, it's the paintings they made, the images, the sculptures that they provided. That's the only way that we can tell how they lived, or it's the best way. It's a very visual reminder of how they actually lived. So first of all, to define Paleolithic, there are three periods in what we call the Stone Age. That's Paleolithic, which, remember, lithic or litho means stone. So Paleolithic means old Stone Age. Mesolithic means middle Stone Age. And Neolithic, the most recent of the Stone Ages, is New Stone Age. So that's a little bit of a breakdown of those. Make sure you can define those. And today we're starting with looking at these cave paintings. This one in particular was found in France, and it was discovered in 1994 by a few people, one of whom was named Chauvet. So that's why today we call this cave the Chauvet Cave. And it's a really drastic and amazing record of what was going on. In fact, it was so startling and mind-boggling that at the time they thought that it was a hoax, that it was perhaps faked because of the realism. If you look at the realism in the images, like this lion panel here, or if you look at the detail, the shading, the drama, the movement here, they carbon dated it and found out that it was 30,000 years old. So this is very old in the Paleolithic times. This is as the society was nomadic. They're hunters, they're gatherers, and they're living in small communities of probably families and tribes as opposed to cities or civilizations, and they were not agrarian. They did not have agriculture as a source to sustain themselves. It's interesting, their motivation. It must have been a difficult existence, but yet they're still making art. And you can see in this that, you know, the level of detail was so surprising to the people who first started looking at this in 1994 that they thought that it was fake because it was about 10,000 years older than any other known cave painting at the time. So not only was it really an example of a Paleolithic amazing drawing, but it was one of the oldest known and also one of the most representational or naturalistic. So moving to this image here, this is a detail of one of the panels known as the lion panel, and you can see that there is some movement there. And I would ask you, if you know you set out to draw this, how good would your drawings be? Look at how amazing and detailed this is. It's not what you would expect for a Paleolithic cave artist to be able to draw their observable world. Very good detail, and not only is it outlined and we see a sense of depth, but there's almost a sense of movement as well. You got like sense of a paw or a foot here overlapping to create a sense of depth and perspective. So really impressive advanced skills, to the point where if we compare it to something like this Pisanello drawing on the right of the horse, this was from the Renaissance. This is what you would expect, sort of a mastery of drawing when everybody was focusing on drawing and thinking about how to represent the naturalistic world, the observable world. But here we see it almost 30,000 years before that on the left in Chauvet, in the cave. And so, yeah, it's mind-boggling, it's startling. And yeah, with enough practice, with enough time, you could probably draw this well as well, but it takes time, right? So I think when you look at this work, you recognize that these artists were exactly that. They were artists, right? That they were probably trained. They were identified as the best drawers or painters in their little group, and so they documented. So this leads us to possible motivations. Why did these artists depict lions? Why did they depict horses and things that they saw around them? Well, this was a way of, documenting what they saw, but also what was important to them. The animals obviously were very important. So one of the things that we know about these caves, and it's important to make note of, is that they were in a place where the cave dwellers didn't live. So they lived in the front of the cave, and these were far in the back, in the recesses of the caves. So we know they weren't just to say decorate their habitats or their home. It was more than that, right? So possible motivations. Obviously, if you're a hunter and a gatherer, animals are very important to your ability to survive, and so that makes sense for animals. So this could be ceremonial. We also know that there was fire pits that were found near and in the same room as these cave paintings, and they would dance around the fire because there's footprints still left in there. So we could see this as a possible motivation, that this is ritualistic or ceremonial. Also, the markings seem to reflect different stages throughout the year. So another possible motivation is that this is some sort of a calendar, right? Or thinking about different periods in the year and what you might need to do in response to that. So this is Chauvet. This is this cave that was discovered in France. And what's interesting about it is they used charcoal. They used charred wood. So remember, we're talking about drawing materials in the drawing chapter. You remember charcoal is burned sticks or charred wood. So they recognized that at some point, probably working with a fire or noticing a stick that had been burned in the fire and it made a mark on a stone. And then they realized, oh shit, I can draw with this, right? I can make marks on the wall, and those marks can look intentional. They can look like things. So that's how they developed these. They could also burn bones. So animal bones could be pigments like carbon black, and also other minerals and materials like clay, ores, that they could be ground down, chewed up in their mouth, add saliva as a binder if you're thinking about making these into a paint, and then applying them to the surface of the wall. In this case would be the ground, right, or the support in a painting. So at the same time, these Paleolithic or Old Stone Age artists were making two-dimensional images on the cave wall, they were also making three-dimensional sculptures. Do you remember this? Do you remember this woman that we passed around class? So in sculpture class, the sculpture lecture, remember I passed this around, this recreation, a copy of this. And you could remember, that this was carved. So it's carved out of limestone, and it was about 5 inches tall, the weight of it. And this is called the Venus of Willendorf, right? That's what it was named originally when archaeologists discovered it. Well, that's problematic because obviously these Paleolithic artists or whoever made this as an artisan or a craftsperson, they had no recognition, no awareness of a Roman goddess later. So this, calling it the Venus of Willendorf or Willendorf, where it was discovered in Austria, is somewhat problematic because it speaks more to the archaeologists and the art historians who first talked about it as seeing it as a image of beauty, as opposed to what it actually says about the person who created it over 27,000 years ago, right? So this is more accurate to call this the woman of Willendorf. And so that's how we refer to it. Now, it used to be called the Venus of Willendorf. So one of the things we want to think about is, why was this made? What was the purpose of this object? And if you think about the object itself as art, what do you notice about certain things? And remember when we passed it around the room and you held it in your hand and you could sort of feel the weight of it, feel the texture of it. Look at what things are perhaps enhanced on it, right? The breasts, the genitalia, the belly are all enlarged. So that could point us to the fact that maybe it has something to do with pregnancy. And a lot of people have theorized one of the possible motivations for this is fertility, right? That this could be some sort of an aid to give to a woman. Here, if you have this, maybe you'll become pregnant. You have to understand at the time, biology was probably very mysterious to them. So this could be some sort of a fertility aid, or maybe given to someone as a gift after they were pregnant. So that's one possible motivation if we think about a fertility doll or a fertility aid or a fertility goddess even, right? Another possible motivation is that we think about where these have been discovered. So a lot of them were buried in fields. So some modern scholars believe that crops were mysterious. This wasn't an agricultural society. So you could imagine them, say, praying to the gods to give them plants, right? And so a lot of these were buried and found in fields. Perhaps they were fertility or harvest aids or goddesses to pray to the gods, give us plants, give us crops. Another possible motivation were that these were dolls or guardian figures or simply just an image of beauty to represent women. And I think it's interesting to think about, if you look at this, if you look at the way that it's rendered and there's no detail in the head and instead it has this sort of textural braiding on it, that might give some credence to the idea that it represents women as opposed to one particular woman in general. So these are all possible motivations. Fertility goddess, that these could be used for harvesting plants perhaps, that this is a doll maybe, or this is simply a guardian figure or an image of beauty. These are all possible motivations for creating this image. What's interesting, if we look at, there's been hundreds, if not thousands of these found throughout fields in Northern Europe, so the same period from the Paleolithic times, the Old Stone Age, from about 15,000 to 25,000 BCE, we see these images, and here's our woman of Willendorf here, and look at this one here, looks very, very similar to it. But then these up here get much more abstract. So this perhaps gives us more, to draw on knowledge base wise to make it a determination. Were these about beauty? What do you think? Were these simply dolls, mementos? Or are they fertility aids, right? That's kind of the conventional wisdom that these were made for that purpose. It's really interesting to think about the context. So moving now into first Mesolithic, or the Middle Stone Age. That's from about 18,000 to 15,000 BCE. And Middle Stone Age becomes a little bit more agrarian. This is moving after the last great ice age. And people are able to start cultivate food grains, storing food, planting foods, and then moving into the Neolithic, which first starts in the Middle East and works its way across Europe. The development gets to England last, but this is during Neolithic time now. And you can see this is probably built in the range of about 2000 BCE. This is Stonehenge. So this is 4,000 years old. First of all, if we are to look at this as a structure, I want you to be thinking about what this looks like. Okay, so I'm going to draw a little picture over here. And if you were to look at this as an aerial view, this is Stonehenge here. And we see the different rocks that build up Stonehenge all the way around the stone. Well, there's also another concentric circle outside of that where there were burial sites out here. So this creates a situation where this was built on an earlier site, and this was important to these people as they were thinking about this site, that it had significance. It had memorial and cultural significance, and likely who was buried in this outer ring before Stonehenge existed was people that were important, people from a higher class or a priest class. Because of the way that they were buried, we could tell that. But then inside this circle here, this is called a cromlech. A cromlech is a circle of stones. There are many of these throughout England. This just happens to be the biggest and the best known. So this is just outside of London. You can go visit to this day. It's on my bucket list. I've not been and seen it yet, but I'd like to eventually go see it. And this is a site that has a lot of significance to it, but also a lot of mystery, right? It's enigmatic. People are not sure exactly what it was used for or what it means. So we also see that there are these sets of stones have a couple of different vocab words. I'm going to reset my pen here. This, first of all, is post and lintel construction. Each one of these stones weighs 25 to 50 tons, which is just staggering to think about. But this is, say, stone number 1, stone number 2, and stone number 3 here. We have 2 vertical uprights like this, and then we have 1 horizontal beam like that. This is called post and lintel or load-bearing construction, where you have 2 upright supports and a horizontal beam, how a lot of houses or buildings are built today. We also call this a trilithon because it's made up of 1, 2, 3 different stones. So those are vocabulary words. This had some spiritual significance. What are the possible motivations for creating Stonehenge? We're not exactly sure, but we do know that there are some celestial events that will happen related to this. So there's certain times of the year, like the summer solstice, where the sun lines up in a specific way. The moon can peek through these stones like we see here. So perhaps the motivation for this was a sort of large-scale sundial. Also, we could think of this as a calendar, right? But it would have spiritual or shamanistic or religious meaning as well. It's staggering to think. This is Neolithic times. This is before the invention of the wheel, right? That's crazy. That's mind-boggling to think about. How did they move these massive stones to this site? By the way, they weren't just right on spot, right on location. They dragged them over the course of a few miles to get them here, where they quarried them. So it's really impressive to think they did this without wheels. They did this without pulleys. How did they do it? Well, if you're fans of Ancient Aliens, right? People say, I'm not saying it's aliens. But realistically, modern scholars, modern engineers have tried to figure out how did they make these. They've tried to recreate it. And the best theories are perhaps they were pulled by oxes or even using snow. So if you think about in the winter time, you can pack up ice, you can make it slick, you could push something down it, but you also dig a hole and push over a stone. So these are all possible ways that it was created, the process that it was made. But more than that, I think this tells us about this society and this civilization, which, to stop for a second there, the book defines a civilization as a social, economic, and political entity that distinguishes itself by the ability to express themselves first in images and later through a written record, which we don't have that yet at this time. So this civilization decided to make this. What did they use it for? What does it say about them? What's the motivation for this? It's really interesting. Now we're switching gears and moving past prehistoric era and into the historic era. So this is a really important time period and a really important area, and that is Mesopotamia. So this is the region between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. It's been nicknamed the Fertile Crescent. It's been, an area that was really, advanced. This is where the birthplace of modern civilization started, in Mesopotamia. This is modern-day Iraq, Jordan, Syria, Iran, that section, the Middle East. And first, what we're looking at in Mesopotamia during this period, after Neolithic and moving into historical records, is this area that's in modern-day Iraq called Sumer. Right? So this is the Sumerian culture. And here we see a ziggurat. The book talks about a ziggurat but doesn't show an example of one, so I wanted to show you one. This is the Nana ziggurat. It's in Ur in modern-day Iraq, and it was dedicated to the Sumerian moon god Nana. And I'm going to just mark up a couple things here. You can see these staircases here, which would lead a person up to the top. And originally there would have been a temple up here that no longer exists. And we can see there's a couple of different types of bricks. The rougher brick at the bottom actually still exists from the original time period. The upper part here is a recreation. So this has been restored, actually by Saddam Hussein. So whether you love or hate the guy, at least he was really good about caring for the important monuments that were in Iraq, these Sumerian and Babylonian relics. So not everybody would have just walked up these stairs. Mostly as visitors, we would be down here. And the only people that would go up these stairs and into this section up here were the priests. So they were in-betweens for us. They were intercessors. They were talking to the gods for us. And in the book, it says that ziggurat, when they were talking about an early Mesopotamian text, it literally called the ziggurat the bond between heaven and earth. So this is interesting. Visitors would be giving their prayers to a priest, and the priest would act as a go-between and give those to God. In this case, the Sumerian moon god, Nana. So this is a ziggurat. A ziggurat is a stepped building, if you're defining this, that's supposed to look like a mountain. And here we see, this is during the modern, Afghanistan and Iraq war. This is American troops that are climbing up top one of those ziggurats here. And it's interesting to see how it's been restored. So this is something that is very historic, very important. And these ziggurats were built out of clay bricks, which you can see the individual little clay bricks there that were dried in the air. So Sumerians is the common name that we give to these early inhabitants of southern Mesopotamia. And in this region, there were city-states that had between 10,000 and 50,000 people. So really large developments, large civilizations that were living together, and they were very advanced. Mathematics was born here, modern science was born here, and language, our first written language, cuneiform, was developed by the Sumerians in Sumer, in this region of modern-day Iraq. So it's one of the earliest known forms of writing and emerging about 5,000 years ago. So we can actually learn a lot about the Sumerians and how they lived and the ways that they created art, which is interesting because now moving into a historical record, we can connect a little bit more with the artists and the people who made things and how they used these objects. As opposed to in the ancient world, when we're talking about Paleolithic artists, we have no idea why or how they made things because there's no written record. So these are worshipers. These are sculptures that were found in Mesopotamia. And you can see they all have this sort of pose with their hands clasped in front of them in this sort of typical prayer-like mode. And it's curious how these were made or what the motivation for these were. So I'm going to pull up my pen here. This tallest one here is likely, and this one as well, Abu. So these were all just known as worshipers, right, because they are praying. And this was found in the temple dedicated to Abu, the god. And so it makes sense that these two perhaps are Abu, and then these other ones are just worshipers. These are carved, these are sculptures. So if you think about the process on how these were made, starting with a stone, a softer stone like limestone or alabaster, and carving the details into each of these pieces. And look at the amazing detail here, like look at the feathers, look at the detail into this dress or this dress here. But what stands out to you about these figures? What is it about the way that they look? Right? They kind of look like they're bugging out. They kind of look like they're scary. Well, that's exactly right. That's part of the motivation for these. They were meant to ward off evil spirits. We call that apotropaic. That is a figure that is meant to scare people or to really create a sense of fear, right? So these are the Tel Esmar figures that were found in the Temple of Abu, and you can see, similar to the woman of Willendorf, their hands are smaller. We're focusing on different elements, like the detail in the beard, or the detail in the eyes, which are larger than these hands here. So, it has a particular purpose. And this was meant as a way of, in this region of Mesopotamia, to worship in continuity with even after you pass away. So after the Sumerians, we have the Babylonians, and this is in the same area, modern-day Iraq. And one of the first kings here, this is the start of this dynasty, the Babylonian dynasty, is the king Hammurabi. And King Hammurabi made this stele. So this is a sculpture that is 7 feet tall, so it's larger than life size. And on it, we can see it is inscribed with a law code. So as we read this, there are all these different articles that are inscribed across the base of this stele. And these are different codes, different morals, different values, right? So as you live together in a community in Babylon, they were gathered together in large groups, and you had people that were related to you, not related, people you knew, people that were strangers, and you have to abide by a certain code or moral set of ethics. And so this is the earliest known law code or set of rules or values that were instilled in the society. So as the legend goes, Hammurabi climbed the top of a mountain, which we can see here, and he talks to the sun god Shamash here. And then he brings down these laws. Does that sound familiar, right? That sounds similar to the biblical account of Moses coming down from Mount Sinai and giving the early Jewish population the 10 Commandments, right? So this is a really similar development and an earlier known example of a law code. So here we see Hammurabi in the top of the stele, and he is eye level with Shamash. Shamash is the sun god. He has this stylized coiled hat. He has this stylized beard that's very detail oriented. This is all, of course, on top of the stele here. And we can see that this is Shamash, because if you look close, and if you're following along, this is on page 397 in chapter 16. If we look closely, we know this is Shamash because he has lightning bolts emanating from his shoulders. A little difficult to see on here. You can see it a little bit better perhaps here or up close in your book on page 397. We also see he's barefoot. He's walking on hollowed ground. And this is supposed to be stylistic mountains, and here this represents the heavens. So this is the God of heaven and earth. And he's staring eye level with Hammurabi, and he's passing on this staff to him, saying, your kingdom is God-given. You're not just a leader because you're the best military leader. You're also godly divined as a leader. So this is, leader as divinely appointed by Shamash. We can see hierarchical scale, right? Hierarchical scale is a definition. It means the larger something is, the more important it is. Hammurabi is important, but Shamash, look, he's seated. So if he stood up, he would be twice as tall as Hammurabi. So it's saying Hammurabi is important, but Shamash is more important as well. This is made of black basalt. This is a copy of the code. There were a few of these that were made, and it was important to know this is how you should abide by these rules. If you're going to be part of a society, you have to agree to some certain rules or laws or morals. even like as a student going to Lyon College, right? There's some rules you have to abide by. There's the honor code, there's the social code, and you kind of have to know those rules to be part of a community, right? And if you break one of those rules, well, there's repercussions for that. That's what this is saying here. And some of these articles and some of these law codes make a lot of sense, right? If you get caught stealing, you're going to be punished. If you kill someone, if you murder someone, we're going to kill you. That's going to be your punishment. Some of them are really harsh, though, and arbitrary. One that I find really interesting is if you accuse someone of murder, but you can't know for sure, if a judge can't determine if they did it or did not do it, then you get put to death as opposed to them. So it's these really kind of harsh and sometimes seems like arbitrary articles of laws that are on here, but very influential and important. One other period in the Babylonian culture, moving a little bit more forward to the same time that the ancient Greeks are practicing art and religion, is the Ishtar Gate in Babylon. So this is after, and this is King Nebuchadnezzar, right, which you might know. It's a biblical name. He was the king of Babylon during the era that this was built. And this is beautiful. I really like this Ishtar Gate. This is actually recreated. Part of it was found, and part of it had to be remade because it was destroyed. But this is actually inside of a museum in Berlin, in Germany, as opposed to in Iraq, where it was originally found. And if we look close, what's kind of cool about this is when you're walking in, so this is the actual gate, this is the surrounding city wall to Ishtar, to Babylon. This was dedicated to Ishtar, who was the goddess of love and war. And this wasn't just your everyday sort of entrance into the city. This was a ceremonial entrance. And what's cool about it is, as you're walking in this way here, you see this wall and you see this wall. The animals here, these kind of like fictional animals, are walking in with you. And as you walk out on this wall, they're walking out with you. So it's kind of this really cool ceremonial like procession in, procession out, beautiful glazed bricks. And so each one of these is handmade, formed, and then glazed, painted on, and then fired to create this really glossy, beautiful, enameled, huge gate. Like if you walk in here, you stand about this tall. And so this is the scale of it. This is the oldest known version of arch construction. So we see this arch here. This is the oldest known example, right? So this is the Assyrian. The Assyrians replaced the Akkadians, who replaced the Sumerians. The Akkadians were the ones who gave the nickname Sumerians to them. They didn't name themselves. So this is Assyrian culture here. Switching gears and moving to Egypt around the same time that art and societies were becoming more advanced in Mesopotamia, there was also a development of the ancient Egyptian civilization. So first, ancient Egypt was at first monotheistic, and then later, kind of as we know it in its most well-known variation, was polytheistic. They worshipped many gods like Isis, Osiris, Horus, and many, many others. And later, so it's mostly polytheistic. Polytheistic means to worship many gods. Monotheistic, mono, one, worship one god. Later, which we'll talk about in a bit, it becomes monotheistic again. So for a brief period, it's monotheistic again. And it has something to do with who is in power at the time. What's interesting about the Egyptians is that they believe in this sort of pantheon of gods and have a lot of the art that's dedicated to it, but they also believed that their king, their pharaoh, was also a god as man. So that's really interesting if you think about that. And this is the first king, the first king to become a pharaoh, and his name is Narmer. And this is a really important object. Actually, Egyptians believe that this is the most important artifact of Egyptian culture, and it's called the Palette of Narmer. So this is about 5,000 years old, and this is from the Old Kingdom. And what's really interesting about Egypt is that the culture existed for about 3,000 years, and there's very little change in how buildings were built and how art was made. there's sort of a canon of proportions, like when we looked at the Book of the Dead, for instance, that Book of the Dead of Hunifer. The way that gods are depicted stays very constant for about 3,000 years, with the exception of a brief period that we'll talk about with Akhenaton and Nefertiti. But that way, that language or that vocabulary, that art was started or began, starts here with the palette of Narmer. What is a palette? Well, a palette, just like an artist would use, is for mixing pigments. And in this case, the palette was most likely used for makeup. And so this little recessed well right here, that's where you would mix makeup. But this one we know was so elaborate and grand that it was ceremonial. It was not actually used to mix makeup. And here we see King Narmer, and he's holding a staff, and he's got a captured prisoner here from an enemy force, holding him by the hair, and he's about to strike them down and kill them. All right, so this is Narmer, and he is interesting because he was the first king to unite Upper and Lower Egypt. So Upper is at the bottom part of the Nile, it's kind of backwards, and then Lower Egypt is in the northern part of the Nile. So we have this ancient civilization, the Egyptians, centered around the Nile. The Nile became a very rich area for planting crops. They could store crops. Crops became a commodity, and it was really consistent and regular, so that they knew kind of a schedule of when things would happen. And so here we see King Narmer. He's wearing two different hats. Here on the front of the palette, he's wearing this old style hat, and then here he's wearing the new style. One's from Upper Egypt and one's from Lower Egypt. So it's showing that King Narmer has the power, the military strength to conquer enemies and become the king, the pharaoh of Upper and Lower Egypt, which we see here. One other thing to note about this is notice this guy behind him. He's carrying this pail here. He's holding sandals. He's carrying King Narmer's sandals because he's holy. He's walking on hallowed ground. So we can see here he's barefoot, and his attendant here is holding his sandals for him. So this is a very important relic. It also is embodied with Ka, which remember we talked about Ka as being the spirit or the soul. So in a way, for Egyptians, this represents the spirit and the soul of King Narmer and his Ka. Here we see King Khafre. So if you think about the pharaonic temples, you know, the temples, the pyramids that are in Giza, this is one of the pharaonic temples is dedicated to Khafre. There was three of them. You had Khufu, and you had Khufu's son, Khafre, and here's Khafre pictured. And then you had Khafre's successor, Menkaure. Menkaure, does that name sound familiar? That's one of the sculptures that we looked at before. Those are the three main pharaonic temples, or large pyramids, the really, really big pyramids that we all know. So remember, when we think about Ka, the spirit or the soul, and the ability for it to live on or be embodied in sculptures, we can see that represented here. And just like in the sculpture of Menkaure, this is made of diorite, this really difficult hard stone to carve, and we know that it's going to last a really long time. And so the Ka, the spirit, the soul that's attached to that sculpture, is also going to live on for perpetuity, forever, continuously. So this is King Khafre. And look at his pose, look at his posture. He's ruling with power. Again, notice bare feet, walking on hallowed ground. He's not just a man, he's also God. Ruler as God, right? You can see he's embodied by these different symbols surrounding him. So this is Khafre, one of the three main pharaohs, the great pharaonic temples. We can see this is Khafre's here, who we just saw. And then this is Menkaure's. The one we can't see over here is Khufu's, and Khufu's was the largest because he was the one that started this large pyramid project. And of course, the Great Sphinx. These are some of the most iconic things from Egyptian culture. It's not in the book, but I wanted you to give you a little bit more context for who Khafre and Menkaure are. Here is Menkaure. Remember, we saw this before. Menkaure as pharaoh. Remember, I had you stand in this gesture, in this pose, to see what this feels like, with the left foot stepping out from the right. This is a power stance, right? And this is the nemes here. This is the royal headdress. This is a vocabulary word that you should be familiar with. Shifting gears, this is that brief period that I was telling you about that went from polyistic back to monotheistic. So it's a really interesting time period when Akhenaten came into power, and this is his wife Nefertiti, very famous iconic bust of Nefertiti, one of the best known examples of Egyptian art. If you think about the pyramids, the Palette of Narmer, the bust of Nefertiti, and perhaps King Tut's funerary mask, these are like the most famous iconic examples of Egyptian culture. So here we see Akhenaten. And in Akhenaten's name, we see Aten, A-T-E-N, and that is Aten, the sun god. So Akhenaten went from this culture where we worshipped many gods to just one god now. And Aten is the sun god, who we see represented here as this sun disk. And if you notice these rays of light that are coming off of it, it's giving a symbol to Akhenaten. Do you recognize this symbol right here? This is an Ankh. A-N-K-H. And Ankh is the hieroglyphic symbol for life, and we can see it's right above Nefertiti as well. Do you remember the categories of, sorry, let me get back to this image. Do you remember the categories of relief? Do you remember those? There was 3 categories, right? For relief. There was high relief, also known as bas relief, low relief, and then sunken relief. Which of the 3 is this? Do you remember? That's right, correct. It's sunken relief because it's barely carved in. It's just the outline giving it a little bit of depth. We can also notice hierarchical scale here as well. Nefertiti is not as large as Akhenaten. So if you compare that to Menkaure and his wife, they're on equal footing, right? They're about the same size. Not the same here. So not only did Akhenaten and Nefertiti worship Aten and make it a monotheistic period, they also shifted a new style of art. The art looks very different. Look at the proportions. Everything's elongated. And he's wearing that old style hat as opposed to the new Nemes headdress that they had been wearing. So I want to focus on this for a little bit. This is a beautiful portrait. This is a bust of the wife of Akhenaten, and she is Nefertiti. And very classical image. You can go and see this today. Where would you expect to see this? If you wanted to view this piece, probably assume you'd go to Egypt, right? Well, actually, it's in Berlin, the same place where they have the law code of Hammurabi and that Ishtar Gate that's been recreated inside. The Germans were great during the early 20th century at basically looting and digging up other people's culture and keeping it there. It calls into question, like, if this is important to Egyptian culture, why is this not in Egypt? But Berlin, in this museum, in Museum Island in Berlin, they think this object is so important that they keep control over it, and it's in this room that's somewhat darkened, a really, really large room about the size of our classroom, and it's the only thing that's in that gallery. And so when you walk in, you stare at Nefertiti at eye level, and she is staring you in the eyes, and you can see it's like you're face to face with this woman that lived 3,000 years ago, right? It's really interesting. One thing to note about this and the last piece is the example of naturalism. It's supposed to look more representational. Look at the skin tone, look at the eyes and the makeup and the lips and how representational this is. We see the Ankh here, A-N-K-H, the symbol or hieroglyphic for life. And we see this pose, this dramatic pose where Nefertiti is proud and beautiful and showing power. This is just really this iconic image. It's interesting where it was found as well. This was found in an artist's studio. So this was never finished or never meant for kind of public consumption. There was other studies or busts or models that were in the artist's studio that was discovered in the modern era, and they believe that this sculpture was used as a study to be able to make other sculptures from. Also, it's believed, some people try to debunk this and say, there is no way this is 3,000 years old, that this must be modern. They've carbon dated it, they've checked out its authenticity, but it's hard to believe to say that this comes from the same artist that perhaps creates this. It's interesting to think about. The last two cultures that we're going to talk about is Indochina, so this area in India and China, and then also moving to Mesoamerica or Middle America. And so the first one here, this is in a civilization along a river in the Indus Valley, and it is known along the Indus River here. It was known at the time as Sind, S-I-N-D, and which is interesting because both words for India and Hindu are based on that word Sind. So you can see that this area was really important culturally and for the development of India and the Hindu culture. This building here was constructed and it was made for a large group of people. And we believe this was likely a bath, like a public bath. So you can go walk down the steps into this floating pool and sit and bathe and converse. And what's interesting about these bricks is there was two types of bricks that was made for these cultures in India, and there was two sizes. There was domestic size, like this size brick, and then there was larger bricks that were for the city walls. One development that this Sind culture came up with was the ability to kiln fire these. So if we looked at the ziggurat that was made by the Mesopotamians, those were all air dried. The sun dried and baked those clay bricks to make the ziggurat. These bricks were formed out of clay and then stuck in an oven and fired, so that makes it stronger and more consistent. The last, and this is an image here, this is a priest king. So you can see the detail in the beard. This is small. This is only 7 inches tall, so a handheld sculpture. Likely this was a death memorial. We can tell that by the eyes are somewhat closed on this as well. So this was carved. It's interesting to see the detail here. The last culture that we're going to focus on is the Mesoamericans. So the Mesoamericans in this area before the Spanish conquistadors, and that there was people navigating over from the old world to the new world, there was this advanced civilization of Olmec people, O-L-M-E-C, and they had their civilizations or their cities built onto earthen platforms. So they would construct up earth platforms and then build pyramid type mounds and temples on top of that. And one of the spots that has been found here at La Venta is these four large colossal stone heads. And this is an example here on the same scale as Stonehenge. So this is a really, really large stone sculpture that's about 20 tons. It's about 12 feet tall, so it dwarfs you. You would stand up to about here. It's taller than you, and it's really interesting to see the detail here. Likely this was an archetype, so this was not necessarily meant to represent one man or a portrait of one man, but more as a sort of a figurehead representing a type or a class. And so each of these heads, and what's cool about them is they're still in their original location, not in a museum somewhere in Berlin. They're actually still in this case, Mexico, and you can visit this today and see these large, colossal Olmec heads, O-L-M-E-C, and look at the detail. And it's impressive to think about. They moved it there, but they also carved this massive stone to show a sense of scale. And maybe this is a Patriarchic as well, to create a sense of fear or intensity and ward off evil spirits or scare people away. Don't come into the temple, right? Because this guy is watching over you. You can see he's wearing a hat, a cap here, which is similar in style to like early American football helmets that were made of leather. So it's interesting to see this. So this wraps up the first part. I'm going to end my lecture here. This is part 1 of chapter 16, the ancient world. I'll do another lecture starting with the Aegean and the Greek civilizations and also the Roman civilizations, and I'll post that one next as well. So thanks for tuning in. Hope you all are staying safe and be well.